was she simply an innocent carrier of this disease in a time before germ theory was well known? That's the major question that I think this case will leave you asking yourself. Now, typhoid fever, which is also known as enteric fever, is a potentially life-threatening infectious disease which is caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi. This disease has plagued human populations for centuries, with historical records tracing all the way back to ancient civilizations. Typhoid fever spreads primarily through contaminated food and water, often in areas with poor sanitation as well as poor hygiene practices. The hallmark symptom of typhoid fever include a dangerously high fever, abdominal pain, weakness, and gastrointestinal disturbances. If it's left untreated, the infection can lead to severe complications which affect multiple organs, posing a significant risk of mortality. Now, despite advancements in sanitation and medical treatments, typhoid fever remains a public health concern in many parts of the world today, but it's particularly in regions that have inadequate access to clean water and proper sanitation facilities. Now, typhoid fever was a very serious and potentially deadly disease in the 19th century, especially before modern medical advancements like antibiotics and improved sanitation practices. During this period, typhoid fever outbreaks were pretty darn common, particularly in densely populated areas where sanitation infrastructure was just simply lacking or non-existent. Or, in simpler terms, people were just doing their business right out in the open, near drinking water, near fresh water sources. Of course, this also included the fact that people simply didn't understand the importance of washing their hands, and that is a major part of the story which we will keep coming back to. It's important to note that even though typhoid fever was a serious threat in the 19th century, not all cases of it were fatal. Some individuals, especially young, healthy adults, would often recover from the infection with supportive care, rest, and then proper hydration. However, the lack of effective treatments meant that the risk of death from typhoid fever was significant, and the disease was rightly feared by many people during this time. By the early 20th century, when this story takes place, there was a much better understanding of the cause and transmission of the disease, and this led to improvements in public health measures which were aimed at preventing the spread of the disease, such as sanitation reforms, water purification, and the implementation of quarantine measures. One of the major effects was improved hygiene practices. Public health campaigns emphasize the importance of personal hygiene, proper sanitation, and of course safe food handling specialties. However, a pattern began emerging over the years. Cheers. Despite having a stable, secure place to live and work, and despite the fact that she was making very good money, Mary would never stay with one family for too long. And it's weird because that was a very common thing for cooks to do in these types of positions. Like, some cooks would stay with one family for decades, but Mary was constantly leaving to work for new households. And not only that, but the households that she would leave, the families living in them were always very sick at the time of her departure. And like so many cases on my channel, she was not poisoning them. Quite the contrary. She was unwittingly spreading typhoid fever through her cooking to the families that she worked for. And it was mainly through lack of hand hygiene. And the thing about this bacteria is that it mostly sheds through fecal matter of infected people, and it gets spread to another person through ingestion. Pretty gross, but this is how it works. This bacteria, it lives on our hands. And when somebody like Mary, who refused to wash their hands after using the bathroom, because she refused to wash her hands, she would have it all over her hands, and then she would transfer that bacteria to the food that she prepared, infecting most of the people who ate it. And I know, I hope what most of you are thinking is how on earth could she not wash her hands as a cook after using the bathroom? I don't know, man. I guess in the early 1900s that was not a common thing to do. But we're gonna get into that, and trust me, it's a lot, and it's gross. The bacteria could also be ingested just by using contaminated water for preparing food. If the water was boiled, that would obviously kill the bacteria off. But if it was used for preparing raw food, that could and did lead to infection as well. First dislike of this video is definitely going to be from somebody who doesn't wash their hands, and they feel like they're being called out. I feel like you should be. And I mean, this case is so interesting because I'm sure that Mary had some idea. Like, she had to have known that there had to be at least a small correlation between her and these illnesses that she was leaving a trail of. But then again, this was the late 1800s, early 1900s, and maybe she truly had no idea what she was actually doing, and she was just a woman trying to survive. Who knows? I don't. All we do know is that she worked very hard. She made a living, and she moved around the city a lot. And in her earlier days of working as a cook, it's believed that she was never, caught, because the disease was believed to really only cause contamination through water and sewage. And water contaminated through sewage was a constant thing. It happened all the time, especially in larger cities like New York, because at the time, clean water was just easily contaminated through sewer lines. So she was, quote, getting away with it, and nobody was catching on to the fact that she was spreading typhoid for a very long time. Although, I do obviously have to point out that wording is kind of incorrect, because she wasn't going around infecting people on purpose, right? She didn't have some grand nefarious plan. But I don't know, we'll get back to that, because we will eventually come to a point in the story where she very well may have been acting negligent. But at this point, the one possibility I thought of was maybe that was just never recorded, which could have actually been the case, because at the time, wealthy families did not want the stigma of having dirty, disease-carrying people in their homes. And the reason for that is because typhoid was believed to be only associated with poor, unhygienic living conditions, which of course on one hand was the case, but on the other hand you can still be rich and disgusting and not wash your hands, right? But there hadn't been any record of her being connected to typhoid in this family before this guy showed up. So this case, like this first case, was a little bit of a gray area, but I had to include it because it's in the research. So of course, the bottom line is that this guy could have just contracted typhoid before coming there, and then he developed the symptoms after he arrived. I don't know, we're moving on though. Mary left this family shortly after this young man developed the symptoms, and it's not known if they fired her, if they believed that she was the cause, or if Mary knew that she had caused it and left herself. Regardless, she moved on and she found work with another upper-class family. She became a cook with another wealthy family in New York, this time for J. Coleman Drayton, who was a lawyer in Manhattan. And it was here where Mary really began to leave like a trail of infected people. From 1900 to 1907, 24 people in New York and Long Island contracted typhoid fever shortly after Mary Mallon started working for them. Each time, the Department of Health would trace the outbreaks back to these original homes, straight into the ice cream. To say her bare, unwashed, previously just in the bathroom hands. Oh. So, the salmonella typhi bacteria on her unwashed hands stayed there and went straight into this ice cream, which the family members would eat. And then they all got really, really sick. Now, after everyone in the home recovered, Mr. Drayton contacted health authorities to try and figure out how the infection had reached their summer home, because up until that point, nobody had been sick, right? Now, they sent 2 health investigators to come to the home to interview everybody, and they wanted to look around to see if they could find where the source of the contamination came from. I remember Mr. Drayton didn't do this to catch Mary. They have no idea that it was Mary at the time. There's no fingers being pointed at her. And furthermore, as everybody knew at the time, boiling and cooking food would most often kill any sort of the bacteria. So looking at cooks wasn't really even on investigators' radar. But as we know, Mary would make that peach ice cream with her bare, unwashed hands. But at the time, investigators and the family, they weren't thinking of that at all. And whether they simply didn't know or put those things together, or it's possible that Mary simply lied about washing her hands before preparing food, nobody knows. It ended up being the male servant, the one whose job it was to always set the Drayton's family table. He ended up being blamed for that particular outbreak. Investigators said that he touched everyone's plates, their utensils, their cups, etc. So it was his fault. He must have had the bacteria on his hands, and then he transferred it to their dining table. And he was also the first one to show symptoms, so that was what made sense to them at the time. And after this fiasco, in her usual fashion, Mary left and took another job. Around June of 1904, she began working for another prosperous family named the Gilsey family, who were also located in New York. And she started working for them in the winter. And this is important because obviously it was cold and Mary was really only making hot food. Everything that she cooked was heated, and any bacteria that she introduced into the food would have been killed. A few months go by though. Hold your little horses. And the Gilsey family moved from New York to Sands Point, Long Island, to spend time in their summer home. I bet you can guess what happens. Mary, along with 6 other servants and 4 members of the Gilsey family, move onto this property on June 1st. By June 8th, typhoid symptoms begin running through the home. I feel like I need to wash my hands. The first person to get sick this time was a laundress, followed by a gardener, and then 2 other servants. None of the Gilsey family got sick, and it's believed that this was because the servants lived in a different house on the property, so they were much more separated from the Gilsey family. So that made sense because all of the servants lived together, and Mary was likely unknowingly contaminating the servants' house and spreading it to everybody in there. The servants also had a kitchen of their own where Mary would prepare food for all of them. So once again, living in close obvious yet. But in her usual pattern, she quickly left the Kelsey family to start another job. Now, a good chunk of time passed after this, and it's likely that Mary did go to work as a cook for another family, but there aren't actually any records of what she did during that particular time, right after she left the Kelsey's family. But I think it's pretty safe to assume that she was cooking elsewhere and probably infected more people. But her next recorded job was in 1906. It was here where she began working for a wealthy New York banker named Charles Henry Warren and his family. And I'm sure as you can guess, this is not gonna go well for anybody. Mary was hired at the beginning of August, so I believe that she was the only new staff member to come into this family's life, so that's important. And being another wealthy family, they also rented a summer home every single year. This home was located in Oyster Bay, Long Island. 11 people in total went to this summer house. So it was Mr. and Mrs. Warren, their 2 daughters, their usual staff, and the newly hired Mary. Once again, Mary prepared all of their food, including her very special summer peach ice cream, and they enjoyed this on the hot summer days. And then in late August, one of Warren's daughters came down with typhoid fever, followed by his wife, then 2 of the maids, then his gardener also got sick, and then his second daughter also got sick. 6 of the 11 people in the home contracted it. And this time, Mary dipped. She did not stick around to help care for anybody in the family or the home after this outbreak. And one of the reasons that she may have left so fast was because of how fast an investigation was launched this time. And this was a really good thing, because the owner of this summer home, he was worried about his future business. Like, he believed that if word got out that this beautiful summer home was ground zero for yet another typhoid outbreak, nobody would likely come to rent it in the near future, right? So he very quickly called authorities to come out and investigate who and how the disease had spread so quickly in his house. The first investigators who showed up, they concluded the exact same things that had already been concluded in the first 2 homes where Mary had worked, the summer homes. Like, it must have been the staff who had brought the disease into this house. But luckily, for some reason, this conclusion was not good enough for the owner of this rental house. I guess maybe it was because everybody had been healthy before renting this home, but for some reason he was just not satisfied with their initial investigation and report. So he actually hired another expert to look into it deeper. This was a man named Dr. George Sober, and he was a sanitary engineer and typhoid fever investigator. And this was the guy who got stuff done. Okay, so Dr. George Sober, he had a PhD in sanitary test had found living, transmissible typhoid bacteria living inside of a healthy person who was not showing any symptoms. And that is the direction that Dr. Sober leans in. He now believes that Mary is somehow walking around healthy, but also shedding the bacteria within her and infecting people with it. And he knows that if he can just sit down and talk with Mary and possibly get some bodily samples from her, he's pretty certain that he can prove what he believes is happening with her. It takes him 4 months before he's finally able to track her down. And when Dr. Sober goes to speak with her about this, it does not go well. Not at all. So it turned out that 1 month after leaving the Warrens, she had been hired by another family in New York. And she had only been with this family for 2 weeks when that family's laundress suddenly got typhoid. Mary left immediately after, and then she found another family to work for. So, in my opinion, it really is right around this time where you really have to wonder, okay, did she realize what was going on here? Right? At what point do you stop thinking that this is just another horrible coincidence? Like every single house that I go into becomes infected at some point with typhoid fever right after my arrival. How is that just another coincidence? Come on, Mary. Come on. I like to think that I would be questioning it. But at the same time, as I said, this was a completely different time. There wasn't as much knowledge about germs and transmission, and she was just focusing on working and surviving, so I don't know. Sometime in December of 1907, she began working for the Bowen family. And this poor family, like all the ones before, have no idea just how dangerous Mary is. A few weeks after she started, a female servant caught typhoid fever. The bacteria quickly spread throughout the house, infecting others, including the Bowen's daughter. Sadly, this little girl ended up dying from it in February, and this is what Sober wrote in his paper about that. Mary was working as a cook in an old-fashioned high stoop house on Park Avenue on the west side, 2 doors above the church at 60th Street. The laundress had recently been taken to the Presbyterian hospital with typhoid fever, and the only child of the family, a lovely daughter, was dying of it. Shockingly, Mary didn't leave this time, staying with the Bowens after their daughter's death. And this is how Sober was finally able to catch her or reach her in person. And it's crazy because he actually didn't even know that Mary was working for them. He only showed up to their house because of the outbreak that had been reported, and of course the death associated with it. So he goes to the house to start another investigation like he always does. He walks into the kitchen, and there's Mary right in front of him, the woman that he had been searching for months. And the way, like, this is how it sounded to me, it almost seemed like he was so surprised to find her there that he, like, dropped the ball too quickly on her. And I honestly kind of understand why she was so freaked out and wouldn't agree to even talk to him. Sober immediately explains to her who he is, and that he had been trying to find her. And he says, "I know this is going to be hard for you to understand, Mary, as a woman, I really understand this. She was offended by this strange man coming into her place of work and demanding urine and fecal samples. Like, put yourself in her shoes for a minute, right? And on top of all that, she was likely terrified that he was somehow correct. Because if she was spreading typhoid fever, she would likely never find work as a cook ever again. And that would have been a pretty terrifying thought. So, her response to him after all of that, she picks up a large carving fork and she proceeds to charge him with it. She is gonna stab this guy for these wild and embarrassing accusations. He runs out of the kitchen, goes down the hall and through the front door. All the while, Mary continues chasing after him, holding out this knife or this carving fork, saying that she's gonna stab him. And she only stops chasing after him once he reaches the street. So yeah, she was not happy about that. And despite her scary temper, Dr. Sober tries to contact her again. Dr. Sober said that he felt very lucky that he wasn't killed. He was pretty certain that she would have actually stabbed him. So, this guy was left in a pretty bad predicament because he was like 99% sure that this woman was spreading typhoid fever around, and she had no idea. So she also had no plans of stopping, and he knew that she would likely continue working and continue spreading it. So she was also a danger at this point to the public's health. And he also knew that Mary, on top of it, was a very special case, like one that they had never really seen before, at least in the United States. After all, she was a carrier of this disease with no symptoms, so she was pretty important to the future research and understanding of this disease. So with that, you can really see where the medical, human ethics, and obviously the civil rights side of why I don't like eating in restaurants. Because you just never know. It can be one of the nicest restaurants in the world. You never know. Dr. Sober goes back to her place of employment at the Warren's house to confront her another time, one more time. He tries to soften his approach this time, again explaining to her that she is a danger to the people that she's working for, and he pleads with her, please just provide me with a stool sample. And she, once again, adamantly refuses, screaming at him that he is making unfair accusations towards her because she has never, ever been sick. And again, she is embarrassed by his request. She slams the door, tells him to get the hell out, and refuses to talk to him again. And this time, he believes that he has freaked her out enough that she is definitely going to go on the run. And he believes at this point he has to do something. So the next day, Dr. Sober contacts the New York City Health Department and he explains the situation to them. And it was believed that they listened to him, and they believed that perhaps if a woman approached Mary instead, it might be a little bit easier for her to listen and understand. She might be a little bit more comfortable with a woman. So they send Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, who was also a typhoid inspector, to speak with Mary. One of my bugs upstairs is having a dream. If you can hear his cute little sleeping barks. Okay, so the next day, once again, they go to Mary's place of work, and Dr. Josephine Baker, she tries to explain that it was paramount that Mary hand over a stool sample so that they can test it. She explains to her calmly that they believe she is unwittingly spreading these germs, and they know that it is not her fault. They try to explain that to Mary, but she is still not willing to cooperate. Mary wanted nothing to do with her, and she slams the door in Dr. Baker's face and tells her to get lost as well. And so the next day, the health authorities made the call that if Mary was not willing to cooperate, they would have to collect the samples without her consent. And this was a little difficult to read about, but I'm still gonna tell the story. So this case really sparked significant legal and ethical debates surrounding issues of individual rights and public health. Questions arose regarding Mary's culpability and the extent of her responsibility in transmitting typhoid fever to other people. Some argued that Mary should have been held accountable for her role in spreading the disease, while others contended that she was an unwitting carrier and should not have been held morally or legally responsible. Legal proceedings against Mary raised complex ethical dilemmas, particularly concerning the balance between protecting public health and respecting individual liberties. Health authorities agreed to enforce quarantine measures and compel Mary to undergo medical treatment to prevent further transmission of typhoid. However, Mary vehemently resisted these interventions, asserting her right to personal freedom and autonomy, and this is where things really got messy. So, Dr. Sober, Dr. Baker, police, as well as a health department ambulance and medical workers go to Mary's home and prepare to apprehend her. And I really don't think they expected what Mary was gonna do. When Mary opened the door, she lunged Dr. Sarah with another kitchen weapon, and then she bolted. She made a run for it, and she managed to get through the police. She ran searched all over the property and they couldn't find her anywhere, and they couldn't find any more footsteps. So it was very obvious to them that Mary had somehow escaped into her neighbor's house. They searched all throughout the neighbor's home and the property, and the people living there swore that they had not seen her and they had no idea where she could have gone. After searching this house for hours, one policeman finally found a piece of Mary's clothing which had been ripped in a closed closet doorway, and this closet had been blocked off by a bunch of garbage cans or something like that. So it was obvious that they were hiding Mary, and that was exactly what it was. She had been hiding in this closet the entire time. They opened the door. Mary put up a huge fight, believing that she was being persecuted, basically like a witch. She did not believe that she was contagious. She didn't believe anything that they were saying to her. But they apprehended her. They took her to Willard Parker Hospital in Manhattan, which I believe was also called the detention hospital of the health department. And this was for patients of communicable or contagious diseases. Dr. Sober goes to visit her while she's in this hospital, attempting to interview her again, and he really wanted to know if she had ever showed symptoms of typhoid fever in her past, and if she had, would she be willing to talk about it. And he tried to explain to her, just like Dr. Sarah, that I know you were not intentionally making people sick. Like, I know that this is not your fault. I know that you're not carrying this bacteria in your body by choice, but that didn't help at all. She had no interest in talking to him, and so in custody, she was finally forced to hand over stool samples. And yeah, just as they had suspected, they found live bacteria responsible for typhoid fever in her intestines. Their hypothesis was 100% correct. While Mary herself didn't have any symptoms of the disease, she was absolutely contagious, and she was spreading it via bad hygiene. Her samples were examined on an average of 3 times a week from March 20th to November 16th, 1907, and in only a comparatively few instances did the investigators fail to find the bacteria. In his paper, Dr. Sober wrote, quote, "The cook was virtually a living culture tube in which the germs of typhoid multiplied and from which they escaped in the movements from her bowels. When at the toilet, her hands became soiled, perhaps unconsciously and invisibly so. When she prepared a meal, the germs were washed and rubbed from her fingers into the food. No housekeeper ever gave me to understand that Mary was a particularly clean cook. In the Oyster Bay outbreak, which was studied with more particularity than the others, the infectious matter is believed to have been carried from the cook's hands to the people who were later taken sick by means of ice cream containing cut-up peaches. Mary prepared this dish herself. In this instance, no heat sterilized the washings from her hands." And so they didn't really know what to do with Mary at this point. She was being held as a prisoner, but she hadn't really done anything wrong, at least that she knew of. She stayed at the quarantine hospital in Manhattan for some time, and then she was transferred to Riverside Hospital on North Brothers Island in the East River. So this was a hospital located literally on an island, which was meant for contagious diseases, and this only situation that Mary would soon be facing. They continued testing samples from her, and I believe of the 163 samples that they took, 120 of them contained live Salmonella typhi cultures. So, what did life look like for Mary while in quarantine? Well, she lived by herself in this cottage, which had originally been built for the superintendent of the nursing staff, and it's debated whether or not she had been given better living conditions than she had previously ever been used to. All of her expenses were paid for by the city. She had medical care, electricity, gas. She had her own bathroom with indoor plumbing. She had her own kitchen where she would cook and prepare food for herself. She made money on the island working in the laundry department. She was also allowed to have visitors come to the island to see her, and she also had her own dog as a companion. The situation was so intense and so stressful for her that she developed a serious eye twitch that would not go away on its own. And since she was so contagious, no eye doctor would come to treat her, and so her eyelid actually became completely paralyzed for 6 months straight. Poor Mary. It's believed that this was psychosomatic, and it did eventually clear up on its own, but still, it just gives you a small idea of just how isolated and stressed and confused this poor woman must have been. The hospital tried to cure her of her asymptomatic disease. They tried to rid her body of the bacteria, but nothing worked. They gave her tons of different medications, which would just end up making her feel awful and sick to her stomach. And at one point, this was hard to read about too, they believed that the bacteria was contained in her gallbladder, and if they operated and removed it, it would cure her. And while they weren't entirely wrong in this argument, I don't know a whole lot about it, but apparently removing the gallbladder actually can help chronic carriers of typhoid, but at the same time, the bacteria can live in other organs as well, so it would never be a complete guarantee. And it especially would not have been a guarantee in the early 1900s, especially because of the risks associated with that type of surgery at the time. And Mary absolutely refused to let them operate on her. I really don't blame her at all. I mean, would you, if you were in her shoes? I don't think so. In 1909, she attempted to sue New York City for her release off of the island. She based her suit on the fact that she had never been given due process, and it was entirely inhumane to keep her there. And of course, the fact that she had technically not broken any laws or committed any crimes, yet she was still contained. She was still confined as a prisoner there. But the law stated at the time that the health department was allowed to confine her because she posed such a high risk of continuing to spread this deadly disease. However, her starting this lawsuit brought massive attention to it, and the media picked up her story, and then the public became aware of it, and the public was very much on Mary's side, and that had a huge impact on her case, winning her a victory in the public court of opinion, because the public was very much on her side, believing that Mary had been wrongfully imprisoned, and also thinking, well, if that can happen to her, that could just as easily happen to us. And the public was was unethical. And not only that, but in the years that Mary had been imprisoned on the island, they had found other asymptomatic carriers who were living regular lives, not in forced quarantine. But these people, they did have to regularly keep in contact with health authorities to make sure that they weren't spreading typhoid and putting the public at risk. So with that in mind, he was asking, why is Mary being forced to stay on this island when other people are not? So Mary was released, but her release was conditional. She was basically put on parole. That's what you could compare it to. She was not allowed to work as a cook ever again. She was not allowed to handle people's food whatsoever, and she had to regularly check in with the Department of Health, much like people do with parole officers. Now, they believed that in the 3 years that she had been imprisoned, she had finally learned and accepted that she was contagious, that she always would be, and that she could infect people. And they trusted her that she would not do anything to endanger the public's health again. And at first, it seemed like Mary was gonna work with them. So at first, she agreed with all of their conditions. She gave them her address of where she would be living, and she began looking for work outside of cooking. But here was the first problem, because everybody knew Typhoid Mary. That had now become a household name, and it was a huge topic of interest and discussion. And while the public helped her gain her freedom, people were also afraid of her. They were afraid of being around her and contracting typhoid fever, and nobody wanted to hire her anymore. She finally found work as a laundress, and that seemed to be a safe environment for her to work. Apparently she never got anybody sick while doing this job, which makes sense because she was washing clothes and fabrics, so it was much more difficult for her to spread the bacteria, right? She was also keeping up with all of her check-ins with the health department, and things were looking good. But here was the big problem. Working in the laundry department paid next to nothing, especially since Mary was used to making pretty decent money as a cook. So unfortunately, in 1912, Mary went on the run. She quit her job. She failed to show up to her scheduled check-in with the health department. She changed her name, and she ran. And that was the key. She became a different person. Nobody knew that she was the Typhoid Mary, and she began working as a cook once again. And things went bad, as I'm sure you could guess. It went bad. So this is now the part of the story where you really have to ask yourself, is this true crime? Like, was this negligence on her part? There was no way at this point that she didn't know what she was doing was wrong, especially since she was now responsible for some deaths. But let's continue. She ended up disappearing and going off the map for roughly 5 years. And while it's not known what exactly she was up to during that time, I think it's definitely safe to assume that she was probably working as a cook. That was what she knew, that was what she was good at, and that was where she made the most money. Sorry, my dogs are running around up there. But I also don't know for sure, and nobody does. All we do know is that in October of 1914, she was working as a cook in the Sloan Hospital for Women chance that that actually could have been Mary Mallon. So Dr. Sober asked them, "Do you happen to have a sample of Mary Brown's handwriting so that I could compare it with one that I have of Mary Mallon?" And it was a match, like 100%, and they had found her. In March of 1915, police and health authorities track her down to where she had been living. They go to her home and they arrest her. And this time, she did not put up a fight. She just willingly went with them. And she was returned to North Brother Island to live in the same cabin that she had previously occupied. Some people think that it was simply because she knew the resources that these people had and there was no point in putting up a fight, while some people believe maybe she was just tired of running and exhausted from keeping up with a fake identity. Whatever the case, she went back to the island. And it did seem that her days now were a little bit brighter. The second time around, she was given a different job where she would clean medical supplies and lab equipment, and she would even help medical staff with basic tests. She made a lot of very close friendships this time with the workers and other patients on the island,